Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second session of the RCEP event. So I see people are still streaming in right now. So maybe I'll just launch a quick poll while people are streaming in. So if you could help us fill up the poll, that'd be great. And meantime, so for today's agenda, so we have quite a packed lineup today. So we have Keng Phang from MTI who will talk about trade in goods, followed by RO, and then we'll pass it on to Angie from Customs who will talk about Customs Procedures, followed by Dylan from ESG who will talk about TBT, and Victor from FAA will talk about SPF measures. At the end of it, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box. We welcome any questions. And if you have any speakers you'd like to address the question to, please also put it in your question. We will also share the slides and the recording of this webinar at the end of this webinar. So we'll share it around. So I think people are still streaming in. We'll give it around 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll kick off this webinar. Thank you. So maybe we'll welcome our first speaker, Keng Phang from MTI, who will give us a short overview on the RO and the rules of trade in goods chapter of the RCEP. Keng Phang, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Keng Phang from the Ministry of Trade and Industry, ASEAN Division. So today I'll bring you through the RCEP Trade in Goods as well as the Rules of Origin chapter this morning. Let me pull out my slide. Okay. Slideshow. Okay, can. So we'll do this in 3 parts. So first, we'll do a quick introduction of the 2 chapters. Second, we'll go into detail on how do we qualify for tariff savings. And third, we'll run through do a quick run through of a work example. So first, a quick introduction. So when we look at the tariff commitments, you see that about 98% of tariffs are already eliminated or reduced under the RCEP. But the amount of liberalization differs across country. So you see Singapore, Brunei, Australia are at 100% or close to 100%. And some of the LDCs, the least developed countries, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, have committed a lower level of tariff liberalization. Okay. So in terms of rules of origin, so you see that there are flexible rules. Moving on, next slide. So there, in terms of rules of origin, you see there are flexible rules that we can use to determine origin status. So it's notable that this will be the one notable thing besides the what we are familiar with, regional value content, change in tariff classification. One notable thing here for RCEP is that it's the first ASEAN FTA to actually have a co-equal chemical reaction rule. And also the set of PSRs will be common for all 15 parties. So that brings a bit more convenience to the businesses. Second, you're also allowed to accumulate across all 15 FTA parties. So this allows all your inputs from all 15 parties to retain their originating status. Another good thing about RCEP is that the RCEP is probably one of the most flexible in terms of the proof of origin that you're allowed to use across all ASEAN FTAs. But of course, some of these implementation issues are still under discussion right now. We'll go through a bit more in detail later. Okay, so next, we look at how we can qualify for tariff savings. So we saw that there's a high degree of tariff liberalization, about 98% under RCEP. But what products actually qualifies and how do you actually claim for these tariff concessions? And this is where the rules of origin comes in. So rules of origin is like the plumbing of the FTA. If you don't understand it, you'll probably get stuck when claiming for preferential tariffs. So there are two parts here. So one, the rules to determine whether the product qualifies for preferential tariffs. And two, the documents that show that your product satisfy the rules of origin. Okay, so the first part of it. The rules of origin is equal to the nationality, somewhat like the nationality of a product. It will determine whether your product qualifies for preferential tariff. So in the RCEP, originating goods, there are three ways to do it. So one is the wholly obtained rule. If it's wholly obtained or produced in a party. So this applies generally to agricultural products, plants, animals, as well as minerals and recycled materials. The second rule is the produce exclusively rule. So where you use originating material from one or more of the parties. And third is your product specific rules, where you use non-originating materials, but they satisfy the PSR reflected in Annex 3A. We'll go through a bit of this in detail. So actually we'll focus probably a bit more on the PSRs because most companies, I believe, will be using PSRs to claim for preferential tariffs. So this is how the PSR table will look like in the RCEP agreement. You see that for every HS code, there's actually a product specific rule that is indicated. Okay. So the basic premise of the PSR is that your product must be substantially transformed. So there are three ways that you can prove substantive transformation. So RVC, regional value content, is the value added rule here. Change in tariff classification, as well as process rules. So we'll go through these three approaches in detail in the next couple of slides. So first, RVC, regional value content. So it requires that a product includes a certain percentage of originating material in order for it to be considered to be originating. So we give an example of a biscuit. The HS code here is a 190531. And if you check the PSR in the RCEP says that it should be RVC of not less than 40. So it will be indicated as RVC 40 in the PSR table. So let's make the assumption that the biscuit is made out of this following raw materials: eggs, flour, sugar, and so on. So there are two ways you can calculate the RVC. So you can use the direct or build-up method. So originating material, which is the eggs here, and you can add your direct labor and overheads, as well as your profits, divided by your FOB price. So you get a percentage of 53%. That means it's more than 40%. So that's counted as originating. The alternative is that you use the indirect or built-down method. So you subtract away non-originating materials away from your FOB price. So if you look at here, flour from Sri Lanka as well as sugar from India, these are non-originating. So if you subtract them away, you should get the same percentage, also 53%. And since it's more than 40%, it's counted as originating. Okay, next. So the next one is a change in tariff classification, or the CTC rules. So it requires a tariff classification of every non-originating material differs from that of a final product at the specified level. So there are three possibilities under three types of CTC rules. So one is a CC, change in chapter. That means it's the most strict one. That means you have to change your HS code has to differ at the 2-digit level. Change in tariff subheading, it has to differ at the 4-digit level, and the one which is the least strict CTSH, where there should be a change at the 6-digit level. So for example, now we look at an example of instant coffee 210111. The PSR in the table is CTSH, change in tariff subheading. That means there must be a change at the 6-digit level. So when you look at the final product instant coffee, the last digit here is 11, and the chapter is actually 21. So when you look at the raw materials, coffee beans, there's a change from 09 to 21, so there's a change in chapter. And since this is stricter than the CTSH, so it's counted as being substantially transformed. Then we look at sugar. The chapter of the sugar is 17, so there's also a change from 17 to 21. So this satisfies the rule as well. And powdered milk, there's no change in chapter and no change in heading, but there's a change in the subheading from 20 to 11. So this satisfies the PSR of CTSH as well. So the instant coffee that you manufacture here will be counted as originating. Okay. So the next one is the chemical reaction rule. So it's defined in the text. Chemical reaction is defined in the text as a process, including a biochemical process, which results in a molecule with a new structure by breaking intramolecular bonds and by forming new intramolecular bonds or altering the spatial arrangements of atoms in a molecule. It's quite technical, but let's look at a hypothetical example. So let's assume that the chemical rule applies to your product and your manufacturing process involves the chemical reaction below. So if you look at the chemical reaction below, you can see there's some rearrangement of the oxygen and the hydrogen atoms, as well as some forming of a new molecular bonds here. So that will be counted as originating. So there's also a list of minimum operations and processes that's listed in the text. I'll not go through them in detail, but basically, if you only do these processes and operations, they will not confer originating status onto your product. So similar to other ASEAN FTAs, there are also trade facilitative features in the RCEP agreement. So indirect materials such as fuel and energy are treated as originating. Accessories, spare parts, and tools are disregarded when you look at the CTC and CR rules and chemical reaction rule. But you have to consider them, take them into account when you determine a RVC. Fungible goods will be determined by originating status will be determined by physical segregation or using an inventory management method, which is recognized under GAP if it's commingled. So this mainly applies to the petchem sector. The de minimis rule applies as well. So it will not satisfy CTC. That does not satisfy CTC, but can still claim originating status if the value of the originating material does not exceed 10% of the good, or if your product is a textile, you use that as the weight. The weight cannot exceed 10%. Okay. Next, we'd like to draw your attention to this concept of tariff differentials under the RCEP agreement. So there are 7 countries that applies a tariff differential in RCEP. It's listed there: Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, as well as China, Japan, and Korea. So what does tariff differential mean? This means that they actually apply different tariff treatment for the same product. So what does that mean? So for example, say if you for your product, different parties enjoy different tariff concessions. So for example, China might get a 5% tariff under RCEP, whereas Japan gets a 10% tariff when they are exporting to Thailand, for instance. So for tariff differential, to claim preferential tariff, you actually need to determine the RCEP country of origin as per as through a process that's indicated in the Article 2.6 in the agreement text itself. And if the country of origin cannot be determined, then you use the highest tariff rate among all countries contributing originating materials, or you use the highest tariff rate for the good among all RCEP parties. So one thing to highlight is that tariff differential is actually a new concept to ASEAN FTAs. So implementation is likely to be a bit rocky in the initial months. So if your product is subjected to tariff differentials, do consider whether the RCEP is the most appropriate FTA to utilize. We have a toolkit of other FTAs that you can use as well, including the other ASEAN agreements and the ASEAN Plus agreement, as well as the bilateral FTAs that Singapore might have with the RCEP parties individually. Okay, the next part of here is what documents can you use to show that to certify that your product actually satisfy the rules of origin. So the RCEP agreement makes mention of allows for 4 options. The first two, certificate of origin (CO) issued by the authorized issuing authority, as well as a declaration of origin by a approved exporter, is available to all parties at entry into force. So this is significant because right now the ATIGA, the ASEAN Trade Goods Agreement, is the only ASEAN FTA that allows both these two methods. All the other ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs only allow the CO method. So the one thing to highlight here also, the format of the CO and DO are still under discussion. So we will update and share more when it's finalized. So the other two options, DO by exporter or producer, as well as the DO by importer. So these are new elements that are not found in any ASEAN agreements yet, and they will be implemented and discussed by the RCEP parties at a later stage. So watch this space. We will share more details as and when we agree on the way that we can implement this among the RCEP participating countries. Okay. So similar to other ASEAN FTAs as well, there are features that we in the RCEP that we can use to support our logistic hubs operation. So first is the third-party invoicing. So if your invoice is not issued from the producer directly, but from the affiliate country and another affiliate company, you can still claim for preferential tariffs. The other one is the back-to-back proof of origin. This is also available in other ASEAN FTAs. So similarly, if Singapore is a logistic hub and there's no further processing in Singapore, we can utilize the back-to-back proof of origin here. One unique thing about the RCEP for back-to-back is that the good does not have to be stored inside a bonded warehouse. So there's no requirement for this under the RCEP agreement. Okay, record keeping requirements for under the RCEP. Generally, you are supposed to retain your records for 3 years from the date of issuance if you are the exporter or producer, and if you are the importer, from the date of importation, all the records that are necessary to prove that the food was originating. And records can be maintained in any medium, digital, electronic, optical, magnetic, or written form. Okay, now we go through a step-by-step illustration of how you do claim for preferential tariffs. So it's a 5-step process here. We will go through each step in detail. So for example, now, so first step is to establish the HS code of your product. So say, for example, you manufacture sweet biscuits. So the HS is 19053100. Second step, you try to identify the RCEP party which you are exporting to. So in this case, let's assume that it's to New Zealand. Then the third step is to check the tariff reduction schedule. So it's not very clear on this slide, but if you look at the tax is 4.7% in year 1, decreasing to 0% in year 15. For RCEP, as you mentioned just now, there's a concept called tariff differential. So it's important that you check whether, when you're looking at the tariff reduction schedule, you check whether the product is subjected to a tariff differential. And in this case, New Zealand does not apply a tariff differential, so we are safe here. But if your product is subjected to tariff differential, do explore other FTAs and consider whether RCEP is the most suitable FTA to use in this case. Okay, the next step. We look at whether the product is wholly obtained, WO, or produced exclusively. If not, does the product satisfy the PSR? So the PSR rule here is a CTH or RVC 40. So let's assume that your cost statement of your product is in the table shown. And if you use the formula, the build-up method that we were talking about just now, you calculate that the RVC here is 75%. So it will satisfy the RVC 40 rule here. So your product is considered originating under the RCEP. Then finally, once you have done that, you can apply for and fill out the necessary documentation. So you can either apply for a certificate of origin with Singapore Customs, or if you can fill out a declaration of origin, a DO form on yourself if you are approved exporter. So to sum up, the RCEP is another FTA which you can consider using, and the advice here is actually to check the tariff schedules and ROO of the RCEP, as well as other existing FTAs that Singapore have with other countries to determine which FTA is most suitable for your product. So depending on your manufacturing process and your export market, different FTAs might be suitable for you. Another thing to note is that certain implementation details of the RCEP is still under discussion. So for example, the CO format and the DO format. So MTI and Customs will update you once these are confirmed. And do get in touch with SBF if you require more assistance on RCEP as well as other FTA required inquiries. All right. Thank you.
So thank you, Keng Phang. So I think now we'll move on to Angie from Singapore Customs, who will give us an overview on customs procedures. Angie, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Angie from Singapore Customs. So today I will cover under RCEP the Customs Procedures and Trade Facilitation chapter. Next slide. The outline of my presentation includes our role. Maybe some of you might not know what is the role that actually customs play in the facilitation of, in the negotiation of the FTA. So I'll just make a very, very quick introduction to this chapter. What are the key articles, highlights of some of these articles that we have inside. I'm not covering all the articles. If you're interested, you can always put it in the Q&A, or you can send the questions to SBF and they will send it off to me. There will also be a comparison against between the WTO TFA and the CPTPP, and some of the comparison of the key benefits against other FTAs, so that you'll be better informed on what are some of the FTAs which might suit your needs better. And finally, I'll just do a very quick introduction to our network trade platform. Next slide, please. Yeah, So what is customs role in FTA negotiation? We basically negotiate the Customs Procedures and Trade Facilitation Chapter. In some other FTAs, it is also known as Customs Administration and Customs Procedures. So it's typically a subset of trade in goods, and it secures actually preferential advantages for goods that are exported from Singapore. And for customs, actually, for us, commitment provisions are in the commitments and the provisions in the CPTF chapter. We will actually enforce some of these regulations that are applicable under our domestic law. So, for example, if there's any incorrect declarations or falsified documents or things like that, the FTA actually does not exclude you from all these violations. So the domestic laws will still apply. So the overall scope and chapter of the CPTF chapter is really to ensure predictability, consistency, and transparency in the application of some of these customs laws and regulations. It might not be immediately obvious to maybe some of the participants here, but even in one particular member or participant in the RCEP, the customs procedures might not, rules might not always be consistently applied. Okay, and when it's not consistently applied, it's very unpredictable. So it makes it very difficult for businesses to actually venture into maybe the more rural part of that particular participant of RCEP. So some of these things, that's where customs actually comes into play, that role to try and put in place articles that enforces or that commits our fellow RCEP partners to actually make sure that their procedures are consistently applied and is published and is simple to understand. So our chapter also includes simplification, harmonization of customs procedures that aligns with the international standards. And we also promote efficient administration of procedures, for example, expeditious clearance of goods. And it's scoped to customs procedures only, applied to goods traded among the parties, and also to the means of transport which actually enters and leaves the customs territory of each party. Yeah, next slide, please. So these are our key articles. I will go into each article in the next few slides. Yeah. Can I have the next slide, please? All right, so for the first article, 4.4, it is about consistency. Like what I've said earlier, in Singapore, our laws, our customs laws and regulations are applied consistently because our territory is just that, this small little territory. But for our RCEP partners, they might have different provinces, they might have different districts and things like that. So this article actually ensures that our RCEP partners commit to implementing customs laws and regulations consistently across each province and across the entire country. So although exercise of discretion is allowed, but it must be granted by the parties' customs laws and regulations, which means that we do not want to give them that flexibility to, today I'll implement this, tomorrow I'll have another practice. So they are not allowed to do that. Unless under the laws there are different practices, then RCEP agreement cannot actually override that domestic laws. But otherwise, it will provide greater certainty for companies who want to venture into slightly less popular or more rural places of each of our RCEP partners. And it will help them to reduce business costs when they expand it into other parts of each of this country. Because with greater clarity and consistency, then there is a lower likelihood of them running into compliance issues. So that's the purpose of this article. Next article, please. The next article is on transparency. So what is it about transparency? So one of the common issues that businesses actually face is the lack of transparency. So in this article, we will push for a few things. One is to publish the information on the internet, if possible in English, but again, it might be tough because not everyone has their working language is English. But minimally, we do want them to publish on the internet a comprehensive list of customs requirements and trade procedures. And we also push for advanced notification to allow and take into consideration public comments on proposed amendments to regulations. For example, if they have new regulations that they want to push out from their customs, we will encourage them to at least seek public comments or feedback before they actually publish it, before it actually becomes law or before it becomes a rule. So at least the public is either informed, businesses are either informed, or they are allowed to actually comment about it. So either way, it promotes a great level of transparency and allow the traders to become acquainted with all these new requirements earlier on in the process. And when when some of these laws or these rules and regulations become laws, this article also commits them to publish these amended laws and regulations as early as possible before entry into force, right? So these are things that we do push for under this particular article. Next article, please. So for Article 4.7 on customs procedures, what we do is that we will try to ensure or get them to commit that their customs procedures and practices are predictable, consistent, transparent, and it allows trade facilitation, including through the expeditious clearance of goods. We do have a set of WTO standards and recommended practices, but what we do under RCEP is try to get more than what is already in the WTO standards or in the WTO TFA. So later you will see in the comparison table later what are some of the things that we managed to actually get out of RCEP partners. And customs authorities must also commit to review our procedures with a view to simplify and facilitate trade. Again, this might sound very, it seems very logical or common sense, but it might not be a really common sense throughout our region. So sometimes customs procedures might be reviewed with a view to actually step back from facilitation, to tighten certain things. So to prevent that from happening, we have in place this article to make sure that all customs authorities in this region, we commit to reviewing our procedures and processes with a view to simplify and facilitate trade, and not to tighten, unless of course there are some loopholes that has to be closed or things like that. But otherwise, we want to have that mindset among all our customs partners. Yeah, next slide. So in terms of pre-arrival processing, again, this is the process of preparing documents and information to allow customs officers to perform risk assessment even before the goods arrive at the borders. So for example, in some countries like China, 2-3 years ago, they still required documents to be submitted on site. Okay, so they have to go to the customs house to do the checks, and literally in front of the counter with the stacks and stacks of documents to be submitted to the customs officers there before goods are released. And this actually creates a lot of choke points and delays in the clearance of goods, because this will have downstream impact on the actual clearance of cargo. So this article commits the parties, all parties, to submit documents before the arrival of goods with a view to expedite the release of goods upon arrival. So we must actually provide advanced lodging of documents or information in electronic format. At least for I think most of our partners are already able to do this, especially for ASEAN. All the ASEAN member states already have their own national single windows, and China definitely has progressed a lot over the years. Okay, so this is a good step forward in terms of pre-arrival processing. Okay, next article 4.10 is on advanced ruling. I'm not sure if all of you are aware of what is advanced ruling. I must also say that this is a particularly difficult article to negotiate. Why? Because advanced ruling is beneficial in terms of giving, again, advanced clarity actually to our businesses who wants to bring goods out of Singapore into our RCEP partners. And usually advanced ruling covers three things: tariff classification, origin, and valuation. So, and apart from having this advanced ruling, we also want two other things. One, when the advanced ruling has been issued, we want it to be valid for as long as possible. Two, the service standard in terms of issuing this advanced ruling has to be quick. So two things are, so service standard should be as quickly as possible. Okay, that means within as short a time frame as possible. Validity has to be as long a time frame as possible. So again, this cuts into some of the sensitive areas of our customs partners, because we are talking about tariff classification. So that means, how do I classify your goods? Secondly, how do I determine where is the origin of your goods? So all these could actually implicate things like tariffs, how much duties, VAT or things to pay, how much additional taxes or customs duties to pay. And finally, valuation. How much do I value your goods, right? So all these will implicate in terms their revenue collection. So it can get a little bit sensitive in the negotiation process. But nonetheless, the RCEP team was able to secure the advanced ruling to be issued okay, to the extent possible within 90 days on the receipt of all necessary information. Again, this is very good. Anything that you see with a locked-in time frame is a very good commitment that our partners has given. Okay, if there is no time frame, then you know that actually the FTA, there's a lot of things that is open for interpretation, but time frame is always good. And it's valid for at least 3 years. But of course, I must caveat that not all of them have implemented this yet. There is a time frame where we allow them to take certain years to implement this advanced ruling commitment. Yeah, but at least we have locked in that commitment, which is a great step forward for our RCEP customs partners. Okay. Okay, next slide. In terms of Article 4.11, again, it is one of those locked-in commitment with hours, with timing, and that is again is good because it allows it gives you some certainty if you were to bring your items over to some of these RCEP partner countries. So for release of goods, that means the actual clearance of your cargo, okay, upon fulfillment of all the regulations and laws and documentation. So under RCEP, we managed to secure 48 hours of the arrival of goods and lodgement of all information. And for release of perishable goods from customs control in the shortest time possible and to the extent possible in less than 6 hours upon the arrival of goods and submission of required documents. So although I must say that actually I would say that many of our RCEP partners in terms of perishable goods are pretty efficient because we do actually inside the RCEP, we are also committed to carry out what we call time release studies or time release surveys in RCEP partners and also in ASEAN partners. So far, the results from the time release study seems to indicate that there is a great improvement in the clearance hours, the number of hours taken to clear your goods. But of course, maybe some of you in the audience might have actually recalled, or maybe until today have encountered delays in shipments or clearance of goods at our RCEP partner countries. But if there are some areas for concern, or there is a particular partner that has not been able to commit to this 48 hours upon arrival of goods and lodgement of information, it would be okay to actually let us know. Because from what we can see from the time release survey, it seems that everything is okay. Everything is usually cleared within 48 hours. Sometimes it can be even shorter than that, less than 24 hours. So, but of course, we are not the ones on the ground. We do not know if that is actually reflective of what is happening on the ground. So if that is not happening, then someone has to feedback to us, and then we will go and sort of inquire what could be some of these possible delays. But of course, if there are certain documentation that is not completed, then they are not obliged to release your goods in 48 hours. It's the same for Singapore. If we find something suspicious or we do want to check your goods a little bit more, then the prerogative is actually with us to check it. So it depends, okay? So you have to find out why your goods are delayed in the first place. We can't solve all the problems for you. Neither can RCEP solve all the problems for you. So you have to find out what is the root cause of the issue first, right? Okay? The next article, please. Okay, so for Article 4.12 is really, actually for now, it is pretty, it has become very natural for partners to actually apply IT. I think COVID-19 has actually expedited some of these IT progress. So most of our RCEP partners now already use IT to expedite customs procedures, including automated systems for risk management or targeting. So, and we are cooperating between parties also at international fora to enhance the acceptance of such trade administration documents submitted electronically. For example, electronic certs of origin, permits definitely, and also electronic sanitary and phytosanitary certificates. So all this would lead to a reduce in business cost that's associated with handling and transporting all these paper documentation. So for example, cert of origin, right? Last time with China, you literally have to print out the cert of origin. You have to collect it from an office here in Singapore and then send it over via courier. Right, but now with our EODES, some of you might know, we already had an electronic exchange of cert of origin with China. So you do not have to print all these hard copy certificates anymore. So this will definitely help to reduce business costs and lead time for the clearance of goods. But of course, again, if let's say the other parties or your business partners want to have a hard copy somehow printed, then that is out of our jurisdiction because that is a commercial agreement between partner. But at the government G2G level, we already accept electronic cert of origin with China and with ASEAN definitely, because we already have the ASEAN single window that where the electronic cert of origin Artiga E-Form D is already electronic in the ASW environment. Okay, so this I can see that actually we are moving very fast on application of IT. Okay, next article, please. So okay, so Article 4.13 is about our authorized operators. So again, we commit to having authorized operators within RCEP, and they will be provided with additional trade facilitation measures, low risk assessment, low rate of physical inspections, and low data or documentary requirements. So the criteria, of course, does not discriminate between operators where the same conditions prevail, or we do not restrict the participation of SMEs. So we will continue to explore negotiating some of this mutual recognition of this authorized operator scheme with other partners. So this article only covers that we commit to actually providing some of these benefits, but it does not say that we will have a mutual recognition with all our RCEP partners. So that has to be negotiated with each party. So we will continue to negotiate. We already have a number of mutual recognition arrangements with countries like Thailand, China, so on and so forth, the Netherlands and things like that. So all these are a step in the right direction, but not all RCEP partners are on board with the mutual recognition yet. Yeah. Okay, next slide. This is a pretty straightforward article on risk management, meaning you do not check 100%. When you see that a customs administration checks 100%, that means for some reasons it could be there is a high risk area that they check everything. But for areas that say seaports or whatever, usually we will have risk management. So which means that we will focus on high risk consignments based on our own risk profiles, and we expedite the release of low risk consignments. Again, it might sound logical, but it might not be practiced in all the RCEP partners. So again, we have to lock in some of these commitments inside the FTA. Yeah, next slide. The next article is on express consignments. So we do expedite the clearance of express consignments by air for at least, but of course, at the same time, we still maintain the appropriate customs control and selection. So for goods coming in by air, we have committed to releasing them within 6 hours when possible, okay? Of course, other features will also include things like pre-arrival processing, single submission for the entire express consignment, and establishing a de minimis value, etc. Okay, next slide, which is, I think, the last article that I will cover. So the implementation arrangement, again, like what I was saying earlier, for example, advanced ruling, right? So we do want advanced ruling to be implemented in among all the parties in RCEP. But again, everyone is at different levels of readiness to implement the commitment. So the implementation arrangement actually fleshes out the time needed or what they have committed to implement under this RCEP. So parties that need more time to implement some of these commitments are our partners in Brunei, Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Laos, PDR, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Vietnam. But it's generally the max is up to 5 years upon entry into force of the agreement. So whereas for Singapore, we are ready to fulfill the commitments in the CPTF chapter, all the commitments in the CPTF chapter. So we are just waiting for some of our RCEP partners to start to implement the commitments. Okay, right. Next slide, please. So how do we actually measure up when we look at WTO, TFA, and CPTPP? Maybe I will skip this and just go straight to the next slide where we have the table of comparison. Yeah, next slide, Nicole, thanks. Yeah, so if you look at WTO, TFA, CPTPP, and then RCEP, in terms of publication of the draft and opportunity for our businesses to comment, for WTO TFA is to extend practicable, and it has to be consistent to the domestic law and legal regulation. CPTPP is extent possible. RCEP is also to the extent possible. Okay. But for publication of final regulations, we have tried very hard to actually publish, to have it locked in as published online and English. Okay, but we are able to achieve to a mixed effect. But for us, the good thing is we are able to lock in the commitment to at least publish online to the extent possible. But we were not able to get them to lock in the English commitment because there are just so many languages among all the RCEP partners. So it is difficult. Yeah. Consistency for us, WTO-TFA, CPTPP, no such clause. But for RCEP, there is. So we have committed to consistently applying all our customs laws and regulations across the customs territory in each party. So as I said earlier, consistency is important if you want to venture into the not so popular, a little bit more rural areas of each RCEP partner. Okay, so you can be assured that what you know, say in Shanghai, Beijing, or it will be applied when you even go to a little bit more rural areas of China. All right, next slide. So in terms of release of perishable goods, as you can see, RCEP has a locked-in less than 6 hours. Release of goods, again, for RCEP, we have locked in within 48 hours, which is the same as CPTPP. But for TFA, there's no time frame. And express shipment, 6 hours, 6 hours. Okay, for both CPTPP and for RCEP. Yeah, next slide, please. And for risk management, shell obligation, that means it's a more firm obligation for risk management for CPTPP and RCEP. And for single window, to endeavor to establish a single window. Again, for both CPTPP, for RCEP, it's a stronger language because we have negotiated with shell provide as appropriate the advanced lodging of information. And then finally, we come to advanced ruling. Again, for RCEP, we have managed to come to a much better deal, okay, if I could say so. At least for valuation, the service standard is 90 days and validity is 3 years. CPTPP is 150 days service standard. That means they can take up to 150 days to give you the advanced ruling. But it is similarly valid for 3 years just like RCEP. Yeah. But for TFA, there is no such time frame. All right, sorry. Yeah, you can go on to the next slide, Nicole. Yes. So if you look at this, all the yellow pluses or the asterisks that you see, plus sign that you see in the slide, actually shows whether RCEP is more superior to, or it has a better commitment as compared to that particular FTA. So you can see actually at a glance that for RCEP, it is a lot better in terms of commitment as compared to most of our FTAs signed with our partners. So that is a good thing. And that could also mean that if you do need to use a particular FTA to move your goods to RCEP partners, and although we already have a bilateral FTA with them, you might want to consider an RCEP instead because what we have locked in with them under RCEP could be better. So for example, USS FTA, okay, release of goods timing. Yes, we have locked in 48 hours release of goods generally with US, but for under RCEP, we also locked in 6 hours for perishable. So for companies that are trying to bring goods, perishable goods over to any of our RCEP partners, maybe RCEP will be better. If you want to bring goods to US, for example, then it might be better to use RCEP if you are talking about perishables, okay? Next slide. Yeah, so again, if you look at it, CEP upgrade, our Australia, New Zealand, Singapore upgrade, actually our partnership upgrade is quite good. So you can see that in fact the commitment is pretty is high. So that's why you don't see the yellow plus there. So the yellow highlight plus you can see for all the other FTAs that's listed here, including our Panama, or Peru, or Costa Rica. But of course, RCEP don't have partners like Panama, Peru, all this inside. So then maybe you would have to then use the bilateral FTAs to bring your goods over to these partners. Yeah, so that's why really it's up to each company. What is it that you are trying to, where are you going? That's one. And then what is it that you are bringing over to our partners, and where is your pain point really? So that will help you to determine which FTA is good for your company to use. Okay, yeah, I think that's all for the FTA portion. Now quickly, I'm not sure in terms of timing, I think I probably have overrun. Just a very quick info slides to elaborate a little bit on our network trade platform. Okay, next slide. So I think most of you would know that we have actually launched the network trade platform in 2018. And we have since also launched many cross-border connectivity, G2G cross-border connectivity with some of our partners, right? So earlier I was actually talking about this, which is our electronic sort of origin exchange with China. So today's press of origin and our certificate of non-manipulation are usually collected by a courier service, hard copies, then they have to dispatch to China. But with the NTP EODES with China, all these are now digitally transmitted. So if you do not know and want more information on this, please reach out to Customs and we'll let you know how to do this. Yeah, next. So for ASEAN single window, similarly, we are already connected to all our ASEAN member states. Article E Form D is live. We have also started to exchange our ASEAN Customs Declaration document. The next one will be for the sanitary and phytosanitary suit. So it will help to facilitate cross-border electronic exchange of our trade documents with our ASEAN member states. But of course, not everything is 100% smooth. We do still encounter some technical issues, and we are working to resolve some of these technical issues. In fact, the ASEAN team has been working very hard to resolve some of these kinks, some of these technical issues in the ASW transmission of all the documents. But I think the e-Artiga Form D, which is the CO's part of the house, is quite smooth now. So ACDD is the next one that we are trying to transmit, and hopefully there'll be less technical issues. Yeah. So, so what can now be transmitted via the ASW? Oh, sorry, I have already said this, so we can skip this. Yeah. And then we have other pipelines that we are reaching out to other government entities to connect. So when we say connect with them, it could be in terms of exchange of electronic cert of origin. It could also be in terms of exchange of customs permit data, of course, with companies' agreement. So the exchange of permit data is so that we are able to reuse this data that you have already submitted in terms of the export declaration, and that data can then be reused as the import declaration of the other country. So these are some of the things that we are currently working out with New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, even Korea, and of course all our ASEAN member states via the ACDD. So we are exploring all ways and means to connect our platform with other platforms so that all these documents, data that is submitted through our NTP is not wasted and kept only within Singapore's context. So we want to actually connect node to node so that our documents doesn't have to be repeatedly submitted or repeatedly keyed in. So these are things that we are currently working with our government partners, our customs administrations with to expand with our RCEP parties through what we can achieve under the network trade platform. Yeah, I think that's my last slide. Sorry if I took too much time. I welcome questions from the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. I think so similar to what Angie said, if you have any questions, please feel free to write it in the Q&A box, and then we will address your questions either live, which I see Keng Phang is answering live now, or during the Q&A sessions later. So next we have Mr. Dylan Heng from Enterprise Singapore, who will talk about technical barriers to trade under RCEP. Dylan, please.
Hi, afternoon everyone. I'm Dylan from the Strategy and International Policy team from ESG. Our team covers standards-related barriers and issues, including TBTs, which is the subject of this presentation. This is the outline of my presentation. First, I'll just quickly run through what are standards and conformance, because this is quite a foreign topic to most people. And then what are TBTs? And then I'll follow through to explain how TBTs can potentially impact trade. Next, I'll run through some of the TBT key provisions in the RCEP chapters, in the RCEP FTA. And finally, I'll summarize the key areas we can work on together. So I'm sure most of you will be familiar with ESG because we are quite well known for driving enterprise development, internationalization, and innovation. What you may not know is that also ESG also oversees and drives standards and conformance as the national standards body, as well as the national accreditation body. So for standards, we work with the industry to develop Singapore standards and harmonize standards under the Singapore Standards Council. And for accreditation, we assess and give recognition to competent conformity assessment bodies under the Singapore Accreditation Council. So what are TPTs? So TPTs, I think, essentially they cover three areas: standards, conformity assessment, and technical regulations. So this essentially means that TPTs are standards and conformance encountered during international trade. TPTs can be legitimately utilized by the government to fulfill policy objectives such as protecting human health or public safety. We also need to note that TPTs only applies to products and not services. So just a very quick example of standards. What are standards? These are essentially just consensus on that provides maybe rules, requirements, and specifications to ensure that products are fit for their purpose. So standards are used in various applications. So for example, the paper that you see, A1, A2, A3, they are actually international standards that define the parameters of these paper sizes. So laptops and adapters, those that actually use the same standard will be able to have interchangeable power supplies. So these are some examples of how standards make your life more efficient and safe. So as mentioned earlier, standards are developed by consensus, and these discussions involve stakeholders from around the world, facilitated by international organizations such as the International Standardization Council, ISO, as well as the IEC. So there are also national standards that are developed by stakeholders. I think I mentioned earlier, ESG helped to bring the industry together to develop Singapore standards through the Singapore Standards Council. Thereafter, these national standards, I think what we'll do is we'll try to, through our participation in international platforms, elevate these to international standards. So standards are applied in two broad manners. So voluntarily, in the case of food standards such as ISO 22000, FSC 22000, VRC, which are used by the private sector to ensure food safety. So many of our food companies that export often need to meet such requirements to assure foreign retailers that they have implemented competent food safety systems and processes. Next, standards are also applied in regulations, which makes them mandatory. So for example, the Singapore SS 600 is a bunkering standard, and MPA has made it mandatory for bunker suppliers and bunker crafts to meet this standard in order to provide service in our ports. So application of this standard helps to improve efficiency and enhances transparency. So moving on, this is actually the concept of conformance. So it's essentially the process whereby the testing bodies have to verify and validate that the products actually meet the requirements as stipulated in the standards. So this example of a cert in the middle, as you can see, the cert, is a proof that the company that has obtained the cert that can be used to show their stakeholders that the company has met certain requirements. So in this case, it was verified by the testing body in the top right-hand corner. And such certification often, involves test reports or audits to ensure that the product or service actually meet the required specification in the standard. So enterprises that specialize in these activities of testing, inspection, or certification are often known as conformity assessment bodies. So most of these are private sector companies, but several government agencies also provide such services. So there's also a related concept of accreditation. I won't go into details, but essentially, you have the checkers, right? The checkers are the ones that perform these services, the testing, inspection, and certification. So accreditation is one level higher. Essentially, they are testing, they are checking the checkers to ensure that they're competent. So that's a function that our Singapore Accreditation Council performs. And finally, technical regulations, which are essentially mandatory standards, which we have covered earlier, and also the application of testing and certification to products. So one example is the safety mark that we see on many of our higher risk electronic products. So regulators use testing and certification for a range of different purposes, for example, to ensure safety, efficiency, among others. So how can TPTs potentially impact businesses and trade? We have gone through what are TPTs, the three broad areas that they have. I think we can see that they have wide applications on everyday life and also in trade. So this means that businesses will often have to face and deal with potentially limiting TPTs. So to put things in context, TPT is just one of the 16 categories of non-tariff measures in the global market. So what I'm sharing today is how TPTs or SNC affects trade. So by now, you know TPT, why TPT matters. It matters because it is real. It's an impact on our trade. It can have impact on the products that are trying to access markets overseas. It also matters because, as you can see from this graph, statistics, TPTs are increasingly becoming more common. So the TPTs you can see across the years, across in the different ASEAN countries, in the orange segment of the graphs, they have been increasing. It's quite a general trend. So these are some examples of TPT and how they can potentially impact trade. These are some examples of TPTs in the sector of food. I won't go through them in detail. You can just take some time to read. I think just like to highlight that, for example, in the example of the second example for the Indian, where the regulator had a draft requirement to require the change of logo from a green dot to a green triangle. So imagine if you are a food exporter, you will need to ensure and change your packaging to adhere to meet the new requirements. So luckily, this did not come into effect. So besides food, there are also TPT that are applied to other sectors, such as, for example, in the medical devices sector. So as you can see, the EU in 2018 brought about sweeping changes to their medical devices landscape in Europe. So what this means is that companies that have existing CE marks and sales in the EU market will need to recertify their products under the new regulations. So this will mean that our manufacturers will take longer time to sell to the EU market. For example, of Taiwan, I think they also included a requirement for all surgical gloves and examination gloves to have tensile strength that's certified to a certain standard. So what this means that some of our manufacturers that produces these gloves will need to ensure that their products actually meet and get tested to the standard. So next, we'll cover some key aspects, some key provisions of the RCEP TPT chapter. So this is more of an overview slide of how the TPT chapters are sort of drafted. As you know, there are discussions at the global level, and I think in the area of TPT, we have a TPT WTO trade agreement, which is a commitment by essentially the WTO countries to adhere to agreed principles for TPT. So these principles state, generally that TPTs must be non-discriminatory and not form obstacles to trade. So in addition to this WTO agreement, countries around the world also regularly negotiate future agreements. So for example, like RCEP, right? So these future agreements often leverage and build on the WTO principles. So in the case of TPT chapters, most of our FTAs would reference principles in the TPT agreement. In many cases, they often go beyond these basic principles to include WTO TPT plus provisions, such as additional transparency, regulatory cooperation, etc. So broadly, this is an overview of the TPT chapter. It aims to facilitate trade in goods between RCEP economies by in these 4 areas. Ensuring that TPTs do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade, enhancing the implementation of WTO agreement on TPT, promoting mutual understanding, and strengthening information exchange and cooperation among parties. So I'll start with one example or one provision that could be considered quite different and quite interesting for the RCEP FTA. So this relates to technical regulation. So what this provision does is that it promotes a convergence of technical regulations because now economies shall use relevant international standards as a basis for their technical regulations. So this means that the economies within RCEP will move towards a set of uniform standards. And then what it means for the companies is that they just need to get their products tested to this set of uniform standards to be able to access the multiple markets within the RCEP economies. So while there are also similar provisions in other FTAs, this provision in RCEP has an added obligation in that other parties in the FTA will have to provide any acquiring economy with the explanation and reasons why they do not use international standards in their regulation. So this is the WTO plus aspect. So another provision that I'd like to highlight is also on the application of technical regulations. In this case, the RCEP provides that the economies shall uniformly apply regulations across their entire territory. So I think this is very similar to what Angie mentioned, I think in the presentation as well. I think for larger countries, this will definitely help our exporters, because larger countries will now need to ensure that they apply the same technical regulation uniformly throughout all their provinces, cities, ports, and offices. So now that we have covered technical regulations, there's also a provision on conformity assessment procedures, which requires economies to accept each other's conformity assessment procedures or tests, or essentially test results or certificates. When not done, countries can actually request for an explanation as to why they're not accepted. So I think this sets a foundation for greater alignment of our practices, which allows our companies to avoid duplicative testing, inspection, and certification. So again, with this, potentially a company with one test set can access multiple markets within ASEAN. So the fourth provision that we'd like to highlight is regards to transparency. So for this, the provision requires RCEP economies to provide full text of the technical regulation or conformity assessment procedure in English. So if the full text is unavailable, we can actually request for its summary in English within 30 days. Again, a time frame that has been set and negotiated. So this will allow Singapore companies, to have access to more accurate and timely information, as well as minimizing misinterpretation from translation. So, and finally, the last provision, there's also a provision whereby we requires RCEP economies to provide notification to the importers of the goods they are detained at port and provide reasons for doing so. So this provision is absent in many of our other FTAs, which then allows our companies to the necessary recourse to be notified when the goods are stuck at customs. So furthermore, we are able to secure a shell level of obligation to ensure a degree of commitment in this case. So finally, I think to really sum up the presentations today, I think these are the three areas I hope you can go back with. First, standards and conformance have key impact on businesses and trade. There are WTO plus provisions in FTAs like RCEP that can help companies navigate TBTs. And finally, I think we'd like to work with us, to seek your help to work with us, to highlight potential export issues pertaining to TBTs. So how you can do so is actually we have an email that you can reach out to if you face any TBTs issues. Maybe you can drop us an email to provide a description of the export issue, details of the port, the agency implementing the issue, the relevant HS code, product types, and other similar export issues experienced in other countries. I think with that, we can see how we can support you or help you navigate some of these TBTs. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Welcome, any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. So now that we are here about TBT, now we will invite Victor from Singapore Food Agency to talk about SPF facilitating food export from Singapore. Victor, please.
Hi, thanks so much, Nicole. My name is Victor from the Singapore Food Agency. Today, for my sharing, I thought about maybe bringing it a bit of a different dimension. We talk a bit about export requirements as well beyond some of the RCEP regulations, because I think for the food sector, there's a lot of different requirements that are in place, even at the country level. So I thought I'd go through some of these things because these are often questions that we get from different exporters. But I also understand that this is rather a niche topic. Looking at the list of attendees today we have this morning, not that many are food exporters. So for those that are not exporting food, do bear with me for a bit and we'll go into Q&A soon. Yeah. Okay, so In terms of outline, we'll talk a bit about the factors to consider before a company wants to export overseas. What's the export application process in terms of working with SFA on this, and the certificates that SFA issues to facilitate trade. So this is an overview in terms of how we look at food safety, where we see this as a joint responsibility between the government, who sets the regulations and creates the enabling environment, the industry, which adopts the safety assurances, as well as the consumers who make smart decisions about the food that they choose and the food that the locations that they buy from. So bringing it right on top, the different factors to consider before an exporter exports food products overseas. I think this is a summary of some of the common cases that SFA sees in terms of companies when they encounter problems. So the first one, determining the demand from the customer. Don't forget that Singapore is but one country out of many others that are trying to export to any other country. In the case of RCEP countries, we're just one out of 60, 70, 80 countries. So if you have large volumes, this will naturally get you a bit of priority when they approve your exports over into their country. So determine the demand from the customer that you're buying, you're selling to. That's always a very important first point. Working with experienced importers. In the food area, there are many different types of certificates required. For experienced importers in your destination country, they would have a better sense of what are the different checks that would be required by their own government, what are different licenses you need to get from your home country, in this case, SFA. That will facilitate the process a lot. Thirdly, reliable raw material suppliers, because your end product might meet all the requirements in terms of safety and SPS requirements, but don't forget that many countries require your raw materials to be certified as well. So even though you say that, oh, my product is made in Singapore, it's manufactured here, it's safe, I've tested for all the different contaminants, no problems, but they require certificates from your raw material suppliers as well. So that's usually an area that we see companies fumble in. And FTA benefits. So with reference to today's RCEP discussions, I think particular for SPS in terms of food, there are a few areas which is covered in the RCEP FTAs that we think are beneficial to companies. The first one being equivalence agreements. So equivalence agreements means that that particular country views the controls that Singapore has in place to prevent food contamination or contamination across moving across borders as equivalent to their own. And that will allow us to be able to export certain products over to them. I'll talk about it a bit more later on, but that equivalence agreements will allow us to export food to them in the first place. Regionalism measures. That is a concept where if a particular area in a country, let's say there's a disease outbreak amongst animals there, without such a regionalism measures, we need to lock down we need to ban exports or imports from that whole country. With a regionalism measure in place, it's just a matter of X number of kilometers from the outbreak location, and the rest of the locations are still able to import or export. So that actually provides more flexibility and resilience in terms of supply chains, especially when you are looking at manufacturing in Singapore, where you import a lot of the raw materials from overseas. So that's important for traders. Lastly, transparency of regulations provisions. A lot of times you have questions around what does the country mean when they say this, and SFA will step in to help you clarify with our counterparts in that country. And just to echo what Angie from Customs said earlier, it's always great that we can get a number or a certain time limit from the other countries when we're asking for information. So in this case for RCEP, we've managed to negotiate, have a 30-day requirement that the country needs to reply to us within 30 days of our request being put up to them with an answer. So I think that's something which always helps us to expedite certain things. So that's always a good measure to have. So this is the part about where I share a bit more about the food export process. There's a fairly complicated process which split into 3 parts. So even before you start thinking of exporting, Singapore sometimes to certain countries need to be approved as a country to export. For example, in terms of like the EU, they need to approve Singapore as a country to export first. Even for China, which is an RCEP country, needs to do that too. After establishing country approval, they will want to approve your establishment, meaning the factory space where the production is done. That needs to be approved. Moving then on, when you're approved by both sides, you are then prepared to get a certificate or a license from SFA to accompany your consignment overseas. And lastly, you can export directly over to overseas. And actually, for different countries, you can start at different points. For some countries that we are not yet approved, you need to start from point number 1, right at the beginning of the trail. For certain countries where we are approved for certain products already, you can start basically at step 2, where you can just immediately apply for a certificate for export. For certain products, they're actually very straightforward. For example, like biscuits, where the risk is considered to be quite low. You don't even need any certification for anybody. You can start exporting tomorrow if you can find a buyer. So these are some of the current products that Singapore exports to the various RCEP countries. I've split it in terms of meat and meat products versus seafood and seafood products. Typically for fruits and vegetables, these are considered to be quite low risk, so not that much problems there. The more challenging ones, the more high risk will be meat and seafood. As you can see, Singapore is doing quite well in terms of the various types of seafood and seafood products export to the various RCEP countries. For meat-wise, not that many have approved. We're about half that we're still fighting for approvals. So that's where the equivalence measures comes in. That means as for certain countries like China, they haven't deemed our standards as equivalent to theirs, so we cannot yet export meat and meat products. But for other countries, certain things like your luncheon meats, our bakwas, for example, have already been recognized and you are free to export it. You are clear the first level as a country level. So looking at then the next step of getting approvals at the establishment level, that the country recognizes your factory. So typically that's when SFA comes in to help as well. We will help to do inspection and help you compile the necessary information and do a verification before recommending you for approval to the country. And just to share some quick observations that we have had from companies who have faced problems during the establishment approval process. For number 1, raw material sourcing. So I mentioned this earlier. Certain things, for example, you might think to be very innocuous. If it's of animal origins, that's when regulations are a bit tighter, there's higher risk. So for example, things like we have encountered chicken bento sets for export overseas. Of course, you definitely need to declare the chicken meat there or the chicken cubes that are inside the bento set. But what companies forget is that, let's say, for example, if your vegetables are cooked in chicken stock or your rice is cooked in chicken stock, like chicken rice, right? That actually not becomes a product of animal origin, and you need to declare that as well. So that's something which companies always overlook. They just look at where's the meat product. Similarly, for other things, we've encountered a case where coconut milk powder, you think that coconut milk powder should be 100% coconut, but in some cases, to enhance the flavor, companies add in dairy milk as well. So then that becomes a product of animal origin, which needs to be declared and your sources need to be verified. So raw material sourcing is important in this case. Secondly, in terms of process control documents, certain things like your HACCP requirements need to be need to be followed strictly. Your product labeling, I think previously Dylan mentioned around your allergen warnings, that is always something that trips companies up. And even down to the level of personal hygiene monitoring, things like your laundry plans. That's something that countries will look out for when they're going through your documents, or how to ensure food safety, food hygiene, and so on and so forth. Lastly, for infrastructure, I think some of these things which we have seen countries look out for during their inspections of our companies is things like, how do you prevent movement control? How do you prevent cross-contamination? Because of Singapore's space is very limited, we always see companies try to do a lot of things within a small space. So for example, things like the raw materials and the finished products are stored in the same area, because that's where the storage area is. But then begs the question of how do you prevent cross-contamination between your raw materials and your finished products. So these are things which inspectors, be it from SFA or from overseas, will look out for. And that's where companies trip up. Now, moving on along the export process, once the establishment listing has been completed, then you go into applying for a certification from SFA and just exporting it. I mentioned around certain foods are lower risk and higher risk, so our certificates follow that matrix as well. So for foods that are quite straightforward, like biscuits or sesame seed oil, a free sale certificate will be sufficient. If you're looking at processed products like milk powder or fish balls, these will be fall under our food export certificate. And if these are raw materials like frozen fish or pork or beef, I think these are what we will issue health certificates for, because we need to attest to certain food safety or animal health requirements. So looking at the export certification process, so first, checking what kind of certificates you require. Not everything requires a certificate. There are instances where you don't require anything and you could export straight away. If you do determine that you require a certificate, then is it a free sale certificate? That is the easiest one to accomplish. You just need to apply through license 1 and give us your license number, and we can issue you with an export permit for that. If for certain foods which contain animal origin products, and that's where you need your health certificate or your export certificate, and we'll need a bit more details in terms of where your sources are, supporting documents, and so on and so forth, before we can issue you with that health certificate. So these are the typical routes and the different certificates that SFA issues to facilitate trade. Now, this is my last slide, really, that just a quick summary of the different things that I mentioned. So going around, importers and exporters do understand the different import-export requirements for trade. In terms of SPS requirements for market access, beyond what the RCEP FTA covers, different things like understanding of registration, the risk assessment of own establishment, the risk assessment for exporting country, what's required for these different countries. Do be sure to find them out. And certain tips working with importers that I mentioned earlier, who are familiar regulations, understanding the size of your demand, how easy it is to meet up with your food safety requirements, as well as the benefits that you can get from different FTAs. I think these will help you balance off and understand a bit better whether you should enter this market or not. Now, and understanding the different SPS requirements, you understand from companies there's always a challenge. So there are different resources available. So for one, if whatever I've said just now around the export process, you can go onto the SFA's website to take a look. The link is here. For export requirements and benefits, so ESG's FTA website has a very good, it's a very good resource for some of these things. Some of our SPS requirements are on the website as well. Tariff Finder is another one you can access. WTO has a good service called the ePing, where they will give alerts to different countries who are trying to implement certain new criteria, or they push out certain new regulations for food. That's when you get trigger an alert. So that's managed by the WTO. So for companies who are exporting to many different countries, this is a good service to subscribe to. And lastly, from SFA's angle, we are also developing our own library of food export requirements. So that becomes a very easy one-stop that you can go to just look for, say, if I'm exporting, say, siu mai over to, say, China, what are the requirements that China has? We're compiling some of these requirements into a library of food export requirements so that you can it's easy for everybody to check. So that's coming up soon. We'll keep everybody posted about the progress of that. So hopefully that will make things easier for the companies. All right, and with that, I think we can go into Q&A.
Thank you, Victor. So I think before we head to Q&A, we would like to launch a short post-event poll to seek everyone feedback on today's webinar. So let me launch the poll first. And now, okay, so now maybe you can start the Q&A. I see quite a number of questions in the Q&A box, so thank you to the speakers for answering them also. So I think maybe we can address some of the questions we actually received from participants during their registration. So I think one of the questions, maybe I'll address it to Keng Phang. Are there common rules applied to all signatories, of each country has their own rules for ROO? And can companies claim product of origin as Singapore if they import materials from Europe and have done like some amount of manufacturing in Singapore? Hi, Keng Phang.
Hi, just to introduce myself, I have Gregory from Singapore Customs here with me, so he can answer some of the more technical issues that y'all might have. So to your first question, right, on whether the RO are the same. So if you're talking about the PSRs and the wholly obtained and the produce exclusively rules, right? Yeah, they are the same across all 15 signatories. And I think Greg will answer the second question.
Okay, for the second question, you're asking about if you import materials from Europe, bring it to Singapore to do some processing or manufacturing processing, and then you export this out as Singapore origin. A lot depends on what is the PSR for the goods. So if you meet the PSR for the goods, then you can consider your end product as made in Singapore, Singapore originating. Yeah.
Okay, so it's mainly on the rules of origin. I think companies will have to look into the PSR. And then I think the next question, I'll address it to Dylan. So I think you mentioned a bit of the TBT chapter. So on what basis will each country apply uniform application of standards? And I think which industry will benefit the most from this RCEP TBT chapter? Hi, Dylan.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, and so I think you mentioned about the TPT chapter. So I think on what basis will each country apply uniform application of standards, and which industry will benefit from this chapter?
In general, I think the TPT chapters is quite sector agnostic lah. But typically, standards are being more used in regulated sectors. So, for example, food, for example, medical devices. I think these are some of the top sectors that we as a team have been keeping tabs on TPTs. So maybe in the less regulated sectors, then I think maybe voluntary standards will come in. That in that area, I think the agreements that we have may not have that much of a bite lah. So probably sectors that are more regulated will be more impacted.
Okay, thank you. And I think maybe a question for Angie. Angie, you talk about the ASEAN single window. So I think what happens if countries, let's say some of the ASEAN countries or even ASEAN countries, they are not ready for the e-form D, and who can companies approach if importing customs fail to receive the electronic data?
Actually, for Artiga e-form D, it's already live. So by right, all our ASEAN member states must already accept electronic format. So if there's any who does not, then they should feedback to customs. Then we will go and sort it out with our ASEAN member states. But by right, everyone, at least for Artiga e-form D, it has all gone live for all 10 member states.
Okay. So in terms of like customs clearance under RCEP and all, so I think you mentioned about how RCEP can help with customs clearance and all, but is there any provision to enforce, let's say if some countries are typically slow in all these customs clearance?
I wouldn't say that we will sort of like enforce, because I think our commitment is not to say fine them or do anything to them, but if they have not been able to commit to the 48 hours clearance time and all that, then again we need to receive that feedback from businesses to tell us that their goods are always stuck, say, at a particular member state. Yeah, because our partner of RCEP, we will have our own customs avenues through our working groups and our meetings to address this with them in an amicable way. We will not scold them, that's for sure, but we wouldn't know until businesses tell us, you see. So they have to let us know, then we can sort it out with our partners. Because TRS, like I said, the survey that we conduct once every 2 years always shows that we seem to be in good shape, right? That goods are cleared within 48 hours and all that. But again, that is in the survey. So we will, if there are really instances whereby it's not very efficient, let's say the clearance of goods, then yeah, we need to receive that feedback.
Okay, thank you, Angie.
Yeah, welcome.
So it's good to know if anyone has any questions or any issues faced, can just raise it out to Singapore Customs. And I think maybe one question to Victor. How can you speak a lot about how FTA can help with the SPS rule? Maybe you can narrow down about how RCEP can specifically help with SPS, and if companies need to be certified by importing countries before they can export.
Right. Maybe I can address the second point first. Unfortunately, the RCEP FTA doesn't bypass the requirement for countries or establishments to be listed by the importing country in this case. But what it does help with is, say, for example, like I mentioned, around clarifications of the requirements. So I think we had instances where we are trying to inquire around what does it take to meet this requirement. Responses are not always very forthcoming. But now with that, we can expect a response within 30 days. The benefits of the RCEP FTA also extends beyond just the establishment listing or country approvals. Even when you start to export over to the country, say, for example, you're importing raw materials from, say, Malaysia, for example, and there's happened to be a disease outbreak in this certain part of Malaysia, which would then, technically speaking, if you are importing from Malaysia raw materials to export to China, in this case, you will not be able to do it anymore because there's a disease outbreak over there. But with regionalism measures in place, we could ring fence the outbreak, and you can continue importing raw materials from other parts of Malaysia, because Malaysia is a big country, right? So that will be less disruptive in terms of your supply chain. So that benefit extends into even during regular trade with other countries.
Thank you, Victor. I think I'm looking into the Q&A box now. We have a question. Could you give an outlook of what is a likely indicator of RCEP entering into force? Anyone want to take this question? So yeah, I'll address it to MTI, Keng Phang from MTI. Maybe an outlook of what's a likely indicator of RCEP entering into force.
Thank you for the question. So I think as of right now, Singapore and China has officially submitted our instrument of ratification to the Secretariat, and for RCEP to enter into force, you need 6 ASEAN member states and 3 ASEAN FTA partners to officially ratify the agreement. That means it's official submission of the instrument of ratification to the Secretariat. So I can't crystal ball the situation, but we hope that that within this year, people will start submitting their instrument of ratification, and it can enter into force sometime next year. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Keng Phang. So I think now that we have Gregory on the call, maybe we can address this. Does RCEP adopt a self-certification or PCO? And can we use forms like Form D, Form E, or CO for back-to-back country of origin for RCEP?
Good question. For RCEP itself, they have their own RCEP, Form RCEP, which is a certificate of origin, and RCEP declaration of origin. So for back-to-back shipments involving RCEP, you cannot use Artica or Form D or Form E to as a first leg evidence of shipment from the first leg. So you still need an RCEP form to show the ship movement of the goods from the first leg. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I think we have one more question in the Q&A box. For tariff classification concern, if there is different view and classification from exporting and importing country, what will be the best way of China to address it from a business perspective? So I guess this, from my understanding, do correct me if I'm wrong, is both importing and exporting country has different HS code interpretation. So what is the best way business can address this different interpretation of HS code? So maybe I'll address it to either Gregory or Angie.
By right, Greg should take on this, but I can only say that actually it is we do not have prerogative to force people to have the same classification as us. So it is really up to each country's own regulations and how they classify certain products. So I won't be surprised if let's say our RCEP partner classifies a product slightly differently from us, but there should not be a marked contrast. Like if this is a watch, okay, but again, watch is a bit controversial because whether a smartwatch is a computer or a watch nowadays is a little bit sensitive. But if let's say a candy, is it classified as a confectionery or is it classified as sugar or things like that? By right, there should not be huge discrepancies. Again, if it is a discrepancy that is worrying to our businesses, that could also be raised. We have actually encountered inquiries also from our companies over the past few years about certain discrepancy in classification. But can we always solve the problem? Again, unfortunately, we cannot, because this is also up to each country's laws and regulations and how they classify products. RCEP does not actually dictate that they must classify products in a certain way, but there should not be major differences. Yeah.
Okay, just adding on to what Angie has said, we can suggest that our exporters, Singapore exporters, obtain an advance ruling from the importing country or work through your overseas importers to obtain this advance ruling. And then with this advance ruling, show it to Singapore Customs, and then definitely we can issue the CO based on what the importing customs advance ruling shows. Because do note that under the FTAs, that you are required to state the importing customs HS code. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Angie, and thank you, Gregory. I think we have answered all the questions in the Q&A box. So I think with that, if no one has any more questions, with that, we will close today's webinar. So thank you to all the speakers for taking the time to speak with us on RCEP today. Thank you, everyone.